Welcome back to the Banker's Leadership Series entitled Extending Data Analytics from the Boardroom to the Frontline in association with Click. In Chapter 1, we talked a little bit around the business intelligence solutions and how to deploy those across the bank. In Chapter 2, we're going to look at big data. Everyone talks about big data, but sometimes it's very actually difficult to really define what it is and who owns the data in the bank. So that's the first question I'd like to ask Chabe. It's really in CaixaBank, who owns the data?
Mm-hmm. This was a great challenge in the project because at the beginning of the project we wanted to break silos of information. We had, as many banks I suppose, data marts or data warehouses for the risk people, for the audit people, for the commercial people. And we started to build a corporate model. So we don't want to say who's the owner of the data. We are looking for departments that start to make taking care of the data. Okay, they are in charge of the data, not the owner. The owner, in fact, is the one committee that we had set up. Is the data governance committee that is directed by 3 executive directors from financial department, from risk department, and from IT department. And this is the point where all the data is defined, with all the transformation that they must to do, and the audit trail that I have to put in documents and reports to explain to the regulators or to the market where is this data come from.
Okay. And Dan?
That's interesting. I think for me, there are lots of repositories of data around the bank, and I think what we focused on there is very much first-party data. Mm-hmm. Now, I think there's a lot of information that's becoming much more available and will continue to be so, what with regulations like PSD2, etc., coming in, where actually that information is going to be shared. And so it's not necessarily who owns the data, it's more about who masters that data, who's the custodian of it. But we come back to this question of what do we do with it? How do we get some value out of that? And that really is going to be one of the big challenges. You need to, it's no longer the data that's valuable, it's what you do with that information. So is that about owning the customer journey, or is that about owning the relationship in a very deep way, rather than simply the data?
Is that where, sorry to interrupt you, Joe, is that where data then becomes intelligence? Because you're creating, you're combining data sources to your point.
Rather than just information.
Insights,
absolutely.
Right? Exactly.
Yes.
Because I think that's, to me, is the big challenge. As we said, we know we can point at these piles of data. Bank of America, we have a lot of data, right? But it's the intelligence that we're talking about here really comes from those insights, those things that you can drive towards, which are hopefully good client outcomes. And to your point, Joy, if I think about the title of this series, we're talking about insights at the very board level of the company, right the way down to the person on the street, right, Duncan?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you talk about insights and bringing together departments, breaking down silos, and that's absolutely where the insights come from. But you'd be amazed how many people don't have that capability. But I look at the business and think, well, how can people draw insights in the credit process if the salespeople and the risk people aren't talking to each other? It's vital for people to share information. I think where people do share information and they apply analytical techniques to that combined data, then there are genuine insights to be made. It gives you competitive advantage.
But what about the quality of the data? Because that's another big challenge, I think, that banks definitely face. Dan?
So quality is always a challenge with data. So you've got to collect it at some point, and there's always a risk that that's not captured in exactly the right way. I think so banking is a hugely regulated industry, so much of that is defined, and actually pretty well defined and pretty well done. I think the really interesting one for me comes more in terms of trust for the data. So if we have a repository of data and we understand what our error band is, so we have a certain tolerance on that, is that sufficient for maybe in terms of strategic decision making, etc. So is that often that's a more important measure than simply data quality. So it's how much do we trust the data, how much do we know we can believe it, and do we understand where the gaps in it are?
Chabe?
No, I agree with this position, and for many purposes like commercial projects and so on, it's enough to feel comfortable with a certain level of quality. But there are also some of the data that we use basically for the regulatory reporting that we need to get 100% of accuracy, because they are demanding us as a bank. So we are at this moment, we are investing a lot of resources in data quality, and we try to solve the problems in the source, not in the informational system, because there is the point or the key point to solve definitely. So well, for regulatory reporting, I think that is something different from the rest of the purposes or the users that you have with data.
I think you're right. I mean, for me, so there are certain elements of the data landscape or the information landscape that are finite, well-defined, well-structured, well-regulated. So I know we're going to talk about fraud later on in the series, for example, but that's a great example of where you're looking at signal intelligence within a noise of information that can be geolocational, it can be behavioral, it can be informational, it can be, trending and pattern matching and that kind of stuff. That to me is where the level of confidence that you have in your signals, and you're trying to correlate a lot of signals. So should that person be there? Are they doing the right thing? Is that something they've done before? Or is that an abnormal behavior? Happens a lot in the front office where you look at trading patterns. Those are different kinds of business intelligence that can be used where you're looking really for a confidence factor. It's kind of, I've seen them do that multiple times before. That looks fairly normal to me, or is that an abnormal behavior? And if we think about fintech and that kind of stuff, that's teaching us new ways to look at things and the ways that you might evaluate the way you use your phone, for example.
But when you talk about bringing together different stakeholders across the bank to look at data and to, curate data in that sense, how do you go about really defining and implementing enterprise data strategy?
Mm-hmm. So I think you've definitely seen the emergence of the CDO, so the Chief Data Office. Now the challenge is that data is no longer, one thing that's a small repository. It perforates everything. And so I think the role of that varies depending on exactly what we're doing with that. So much of it is around, it's around having that strategy, standards and control around data. That's often part of the pillar. There's another bit which is around tying it up and understanding how different elements relate to each other and how broadly we get these huge machines to move in the same direction. So I think that's the approach we have at Barclays. So certainly in terms of a matrix structure there, where you have an oversight layer in the CDO, and then your different areas that are very targeted towards driving an outcome, maybe in a certain departmental, how do I focus on the client? What are the needs of this client? And pushing that way on a business line or a product line.
Duncan, from your perspective, looking across the financial services industry, do you see a lot of enterprise data strategies? Are they being developed?
Yes, they are being developed. They're a kind of emerging area because, believe it or not everybody has a clearly defined data strategy. But I think everyone feels now that there is a pressure to get one quickly. And a lot of relationships need to be forged in areas that didn't always communicate that well. So enabling parts of the business to get together and say, well, in order to solve a specific problem, to sell a product or to manage a certain type of risk, we need these sources of information. And they have to have a very good relationship with the CIO's organization in order to go and gather that data and build a platform that they can trust to deliver that information. So silos are gone, and working together is kind of the new norm.
The only thing I'd say to that is we talked about how regulated the banking industry was. We have to be cognizant in building these strategies that you're thinking about not only who owns the data, but who needs to use that data. There are information walls within the organization, just like there are in many different organizations, not just in banking. But you've got to learn how to respect those information walls so that different businesses can operate correctly, but you also protect the integrity of the obligations that you have in a legal and regulatory requirement.
Okay. In Chapter 3 of this 5-part leadership series, we're going to be looking at data governance and security.